She was called a savage, chained, and nearly sold like property. But one man looked past what others saw, and everything changed. What would make a grieving man open his heart to a child from a world so different than his own? And why did she choose him when no one else showed her kindness? This is not just a story about survival. It's about the unlikely creation of a family that defied the rules of their time. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. In the dusty borderlands of Arizona, 1875, 8-year-old Nita hid among the sagebrush, watching as smoke billowed from her Apache village. The raid had come at dawn, white settlers and soldiers attacking without warning. Her mother had pushed her into the brush with desperate whispers to run and not look back. Now, trembling and alone, Nita could only watch as the last embers of her world burned away. 3 days later, dehydrated and starving, she was discovered by traders who saw opportunity in her misfortune. "Got ourselves a wild Apache girl," one sneered, roughly binding her small wrists. "The boarding schools pay good money for savages to civilize." In Santa Fe, Thomas Wilson browsed the general store with little interest. At 42, the railroad engineer's life had become an empty routine since losing his wife Sarah to tuberculosis 2 years prior. Their childless home echoed with silence each evening when he returned from work. "Special merchandise today," the shopkeeper muttered to Thomas. "Indian girl, 8, maybe 9 years old. School or household help if you're interested. Better than letting her kind run wild." Thomas followed reluctantly to a back room where Nita sat huddled in a corner, dirt-streaked and defiant despite her fear. Their eyes met, his filled with unexpected recognition of shared grief, hers burning with distrust. "What's your name, child?" Thomas asked gently in broken Apache words he'd learned from native workers on the railroad. Nita remained silent, but something in his tone, so different from the harsh voices she'd heard since her capture, made her look up. "I lost my family, too," he said simply, showing her a locket with Sarah's picture. "Being alone hurts more than anything." The shopkeeper interrupted impatiently. $50 takes her. Someone else will buy if you won't." Thomas felt a wave of disgust at the transaction, but understood the reality. Either he paid this man, or someone with crueler intentions would. "I'll take her," he said firmly, "but not as a servant." That evening, in Thomas's modest home on the outskirts of town, Nita sat rigid at the kitchen table, expecting the worst, despite the gentle way this white man had spoken to her. "You're safe here," Thomas said, placing a plate of food before her. "I know you don't understand much of what I'm saying, but I promise no one will hurt you." When nightmares woke her screaming in the small bedroom he'd prepared, Thomas sat patiently in the doorway, not approaching but simply present, humming the same lullaby his wife had once loved. By morning, the shopkeeper's daughter had arrived with a local missionary woman. "Mr. Wilson, we've come to take the Indian child to the school," the missionary announced. "It's for the best. They need proper Christian discipline to remove their savage ways." Thomas stood firmly in his doorway. "She's not going anywhere. I've filed guardianship papers with Judge Parker. She stays with me." The women left in indignant huffs, spreading rumors through town about the widower and his savage ward. That afternoon, Thomas brought home a book of Apache words and simple phrases. He sat beside Nita, pointing to pictures and pronouncing words in both languages. For the first time, a flicker of interest crossed her face. "Nita," she whispered finally, pointing to herself. It was the first word she'd spoken since her arrival. Thomas smiled. "Nita," he repeated. "I'm Thomas." He paused, then added gently, "Not father. Never to replace your father, but family, if you'll have me." As the sun set over the distant mountains, Thomas stood on the porch watching Nita tentatively explore the small garden. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. The town's prejudice, her trauma, the cultural divide between them. But in that moment, watching her stop to examine a desert flower with curiosity rather than fear, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Hope. Nita glanced back at him, her expression still guarded but no longer filled with terror. It was a beginning, fragile as the desert bloom she'd found, but growing nonetheless in the most unlikely of places. 6 months had passed since Thomas brought Nita into his home. Winter had settled over the New Mexico territory, bringing cold winds that rattled the windows of their small house. Inside, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, his calloused fingers carefully holding a pencil as Nita pointed to different objects around the room. "Chair," she said in English, her accent still thick, but her vocabulary growing daily. "Good," Thomas nodded, writing the word in his notebook alongside its Apache equivalent. Their evening ritual had become sacred to both of them, this quiet exchange of languages bridging the vast divide between their worlds. "Book," Nita continued, touching the worn Bible on the shelf. When a knock interrupted their lesson, Thomas saw Nita immediately tense. Despite the months of safety, she still feared being taken away. The town's hostility remained an invisible barrier around their home. "Evening, Wilson," Sheriff Dawson said gruffly when Thomas opened the door. "School board's asking again why. That Indian girl ain't enrolled. Missionary ladies are making a fuss about it." Thomas stood straighter. "Nita's learning just fine here with me." The sheriff glanced past him to where Nita watched warily from the kitchen doorway. "Folks are talking, Wilson. Man living alone with a child that ain't his. An Indian child at that." "Let them talk," Thomas replied evenly. "Judge Parker approved my guardianship." After the sheriff left, Thomas found Nita clutching the small wooden horse he'd carved for her birthday, the date itself an estimation since she couldn't remember her exact birth date. "No school?" she asked quietly. Thomas knelt beside her. "Only if you want to go." He'd seen the missionary schools, watched how they stripped Apache children of their language, their customs, their very identities. Nita shook her head firmly. "Learn here, with you." The next morning brought more trouble. As they walked to the general store for supplies, Mrs. Harrington, the banker's wife, crossed the street to avoid them, pulling her young daughter along with whispered warnings about the savage child. Though Nita's English wasn't perfect, she understood enough to flinch at the woman's words. "Their fear speaks more about them than about you," Thomas said gently, squeezing her small hand in his. Inside the store, the new shopkeeper, who had replaced the man who'd once tried to sell Nita, watched them nervously, but took Thomas's money for flour and beans without comment. Progress, however small. It wasn't until they reached the edge of town that real trouble found them. 3 boys, sons of prominent townspeople, blocked their path, throwing pebbles at Nita. "Apache savage," the oldest taunted. "My pa says your kind scalped his cousin." Thomas stepped forward protectively, but to his surprise, Nita moved beside him rather than behind him. "Not savage," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her fear. "My name is Nita." The simple dignity in her stance silenced the boys momentarily, allowing Thomas and Nita to walk past. Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. Pride at her courage, sorrow that she needed such bravery at only 9 years old. That evening, as snow began to fall outside their window, Nita finally asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "Why? They hate Apache?" Thomas set aside the shirt he was mending and considered how to explain generations of violence, fear, and misunderstanding to a child. "Some people fear what they don't understand," he began carefully. "And fear can make people cruel. You not afraid?" "I was once," he admitted. "Before I worked on the railroad with Apache men, before I learned their words and stories, before I met you." Nita nodded thoughtfully, then retrieved something from beneath her bed, a small deerskin pouch embroidered with beads. Opening it, she removed a carved stone bear, worn smooth by generations of handling. "Mother gave," she explained, her eyes distant with memory, "for protection, for courage." She held it out to Thomas. "For you now." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "No, Nita. It's your family's, your memory." She shook her head firmly. "You family now, too." Later that night, after Nita had fallen asleep, Thomas sat by the fire writing a letter to his brother in Boston. a respected attorney whose connections might help secure Nita's future should anything happen to him. He enclosed a photograph they'd had taken in Santa Fe, Nita sitting stiffly in her new dress, Thomas standing behind her with a protective hand on her shoulder. "She is my daughter in every way that matters," he wrote. "But this town will never fully accept her. Should the need arise, I trust you will ensure she isn't sent to the government schools." As he sealed the envelope, Thomas heard Nita cry out in her sleep. Another nightmare. Moving quietly to her room, he began to hum the lullaby that always seemed to calm her. But tonight, instead of simply sitting in the doorway, he found himself invited in by her small, outstretched hand. "Stay," she whispered. Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, continuing the melody until her breathing steadied. As snowflakes danced outside her window, he realized something had shifted between them. The trust so difficult to build had deepened into something more profound, a bond that transcended blood and race and all the artificial boundaries that separated their worlds. "Sleep well, my daughter," he whispered in Apache, using the words she had carefully taught him. In her sleep, Nita smiled. Spring, 1880. The New Mexico landscape had erupted in scattered wildflowers, painting the typically dusty terrain with splashes of yellow and purple. 5 years had passed since Thomas had brought Nita home, and at 13, she moved with quiet confidence through the garden they'd built together behind their house. "The carrots need more time," she called to Thomas in perfect English, though they often still spoke Apache at home. Her long black hair was braided down her back, and she wore a simple calico dress with moccasins she'd made herself, a deliberate blending of her two worlds. Thomas looked up from the chicken coop he was repairing. At 47, silver-streaked. His once brown hair and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Years of defending their unconventional family against town prejudice had taken its toll, but watching Nita flourish made every battle worthwhile. "Mr. Wilson," a young voice interrupted their peaceful morning. Billy Stevens, the telegraph operator's son, came running down the path. "Pa sent me to fetch you. Urgent wire from Boston." Thomas felt a chill despite the warm air. His brother hadn't telegraphed in nearly a year. "Stay with Nita," he told Billy, whose family had gradually become their allies in town. "I'll be back soon." At the telegraph office, Mr. Stevens handed him the message without meeting his eyes. "Sorry, Thomas." The yellow paper trembled in Thomas's hands as he read, "Brother Robert Wilson passed unexpectedly. Stop funeral. Saturday. Stop presents requested for will reading. Stop reply urgently." Stop Thomas leaned heavily against the counter. Robert, his only remaining family besides Nita, his advocate from afar, gone without warning. The loss stung sharply, but practical concerns immediately followed. He hadn't left Nita since bringing her home, had never traveled with her beyond Santa Fe. When he returned home, Nita knew immediately something was wrong. She'd grown perceptive to his moods, could read the grief in his posture before he spoke a word. "Someone died," she said simply, wiping garden soil from her hands. Thomas nodded, explaining about his brother as they sat on the porch steps. "I need to go to Boston," he finished, "for the funeral and some legal matters." Nita's face remained composed, but her fingers twisted in her apron. "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Thomas watched understanding dawn on her face. "You're taking me with you," she said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Thomas had already decided. "You're my daughter. Where I go, you go." That evening, as Nita packed her best clothes, Thomas visited Judge Parker, who had supported their family from the beginning. The aging judge listened thoughtfully to Thomas's concerns about traveling east with Nita. "The attitudes aren't much different there, Thomas," he warned. "Perhaps more sophisticated in their expression, but no less damaging. And Boston society has its own rigid hierarchies." "She's stronger than they know," Thomas replied. "Stronger than I was at her age." Judge Parker nodded, writing out official papers confirming Thomas's guardianship, valid across all states. "These should help, though they won't change people's hearts." The journey east by train marked Nita's first major venture into the wider world. Thomas watched her absorb everything, the changing landscapes, the increasingly crowded cities as they moved eastward, the curious and often unfriendly stares of fellow passengers. In Chicago, during their overnight stay, an elderly woman approached them in the hotel restaurant. "Is she one of those Indian children from the Western schools?" she asked Thomas, speaking as if Nita weren't present. Before Thomas could answer, Nita looked directly at the woman. "My name is Nita Wilson. I am Apache, and Mr. Wilson is my father. I attend no school but learn at home. Would you like to hear me recite Longfellow? It's my favorite." The woman's startled expression would have been comical if the prejudice behind her question hadn't been so painful. She retreated without another word. "You didn't have to engage her," Thomas said quietly. Nita sipped her tea with remarkable poise. "You taught me to speak truth plainly. Was I wrong?" Thomas smiled despite his concerns. "No, never wrong." Boston greeted them with gray skies and persistent rain. Robert's brownstone and Beacon Hill stood imposing and dark as they arrived by carriage. The housekeeper who admitted them couldn't hide her shock at Nita's presence, but led them to their rooms without comment. The funeral the next day brought the full weight of Boston society's judgment. As Thomas and Nita sat in the front pew, whispers rippled through the church like wind through prairie grass. An Indian girl. Can you imagine? Poor Robert, what would he have thought? Nita sat straight-backed in her black dress, eyes forward, dignity intact despite the murmurs. When Thomas's hand trembled slightly during the eulogy, she slipped her smaller one into his, offering the strength he'd so often provided her. The will reading the following day brought another challenge. Robert's attorney, Mr. Caldwell, asked to speak with Thomas alone, deliberately excluding Nita. "She stays," Thomas insisted. The attorney's lips thinned with disapproval, but he proceeded. "Mr. Robert Wilson has left his entire estate, including this house and considerable investments, to his brother Thomas Wilson." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. What came next, however, caught him off guard. "There is a codicil," Caldwell continued, reluctantly, "added last year. It states that should you, Thomas Wilson, maintain your guardianship of the Apache child until she reaches majority at 18, an additional trust of $5,000 will be established in her name for education or other purposes." Nita's face remained impassive, but Thomas saw her hands clench slightly in her lap. "My brother was a good man," Thomas said simply. "Indeed. However, Mr. Wilson," Caldwell lowered his voice, "now that you've inherited this significant estate, you might consider more appropriate arrangements for the girl. There are excellent Indian boarding schools." "My daughter stays with me," Thomas interrupted, his voice steel, "and will be returning to New Mexico after settling my brother's affairs." Later, alone in Robert's study, Thomas found a letter addressed to him in his brother's handwriting. Inside was a second envelope marked, "For Nita when she is ready." Thomas called her in, handing her the sealed envelope. "From your Uncle Robert. I didn't know he'd prepared this." Nita opened it carefully, reading slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. "He writes that he was proud to have me as a niece," she said, her voice catching. "That he told his friends about my progress with languages and mathematics. He never even met me." "He knew you through my letters," Thomas explained. "And he believed, as I do, that you deserve every opportunity any child should have." That night, as rain pattered against the windows of the grand house so different from their simple home, Thomas found Nita sitting on the window seat of her bedroom, staring out at the unfamiliar city. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked gently. "We could. The house is ours now. You could attend school, have advantages I can't give you in New Mexico." Nita turned to him, her eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her 13 years. "Our home is where we built it," she said simply. "Where the garden is. Where people may not always accept us, but where we know who we are." Thomas felt pride swell in his chest. In 5 years, the frightened child had grown into someone with unshakable clarity about her place in the world. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "who would tend the carrots?" As they prepared for their journey home a week later, Thomas realized Robert's legacy wasn't just the inheritance, but the acknowledgement of Nita as family. something she had earned not through blood, but through the more profound bonds they had forged together. June 1885. The sun hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the Wilson property that had expanded over the years to include a larger garden, a small orchard, and a workshop where Thomas and Nita crafted furniture that had begun to sell well beyond their town. Nita, now 18, moved with practiced efficiency as she loaded her latest creation, an intricately carved writing desk, onto the wagon. Her slender fingers traced the Apache symbol she had integrated into the design, telling stories of resilience and harmony within the wood itself. "Are you certain you don't want me to come along?" Thomas asked, his hair now fully silver, watching her with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. In the decade since he'd brought her home, she had grown into a remarkable young woman, educated through their home studies, skilled with her hands, and possessing a quiet strength that commanded respect even from former detractors. "The Santa. Fee buyers specifically requested to meet the craftsman," she reminded him with a smile. "It's time they learned the craftsman is a craftswoman." Thomas nodded, adjusting the brim of her hat. "Your mother would have been proud," he said softly, referring not to her birth mother, whom they honored in private Apache ceremonies, but to Sarah, whose photograph Nita had placed alongside her Apache bear fetish on the small shelf above her bed. "Both of them would," Nita replied, embracing him before climbing onto the wagon seat. As she drove toward town, Nita reflected on the transformation of the past 10 years. The hostile settlement that had once viewed her as a savage had gradually, reluctantly come to accept her presence. Not with the full equality she deserved, but with a grudging recognition of her intelligence and skill. The furniture business had helped considerably. It was difficult for people to maintain their prejudice against someone who crafted the tables at which they ate their family meals. In town, Nita guided the wagon to Henderson's General Store, now run by the founder's son, Michael, who had returned from college in Denver 2 years earlier. At 23, Michael had brought progressive ideas back with him, much to the consternation of the town elders. "Right on time," he called, stepping out to help with the desk. Their fingers brushed as they lifted it, and Nita noticed the flush that colored his cheeks. These moments had been occurring more frequently over the past months. "The buyers will be here tomorrow," Michael said as they positioned the desk in the store's front window. "I showed them your previous work when they passed through last month. They were impressed." "Did you tell them who made it?" Nita asked, already knowing the answer. Michael's honest eyes met hers. "I did. They were surprised, but more interested in the quality than who created it." Progress, Nita thought. Small, incremental, but real. "There's something else," Michael continued, seeming suddenly nervous. "The Territorial College in Santa Fe has responded to my inquiry." He handed her an envelope. "They're willing to consider your application for the teacher training program." Nita's heart quickened as she opened the letter. For years she had harbored a dream of becoming a teacher, of creating a school that would honor both Western education and native traditions. Thomas had encouraged her, using part of the trust from Uncle Robert to supplement her education at home. Contingent upon an in-person examination and interview, she read aloud, "The candidate's unique background may provide valuable perspective." She looked up at Michael. "They're actually considering it. You'd be the first Apache woman to attend," Michael said. "It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," she replied, echoing one of Thomas's favorite sayings. That evening, as Nita shared the news with Thomas over dinner, she saw conflicting emotions cross his weathered face. Joy at her opportunity, concern for the challenges ahead, and perhaps a touch of sadness at the thought of her leaving. "I'll only be in Santa Fe," she assured him. "I can return on holidays." Thomas reached across the table to clasp her hand. "I've never wanted to hold you back. From the day I brought you home, I promised myself I would give you wings, not chains." Later, that night, unable to sleep, Nita slipped outside to sit beneath the stars. The distant howl of a coyote reminded her of stories her birth mother had told. Stories she had struggled to remember and preserve, writing them down in a journal that had become her most precious possession. She heard Thomas's familiar footsteps, before he settled beside her on the porch step. "When I was little," she said without preamble, "I thought the stars were the eyes of ancestors watching over us." Thomas nodded. "A beautiful belief. I wonder sometimes what my parents would think of my life now," she continued. "Would they understand the choices I've made, the person I've become?" "You honor them every day," Thomas said simply. "By surviving. By thriving. By remembering." They sat in comfortable silence until Thomas spoke again. "I have something for you. I've been waiting for the right moment." From his pocket he withdrew a small velvet box. It was Sarah's. She would have wanted you to have it. Inside was a silver locket, simple but elegant. When Nita opened it, she found a tiny photograph of Thomas on one side. The other side was empty. "For your future," Thomas explained. "Whatever you choose it to be." 2 weeks later, Nita stood on the platform of the Santa Fe station, her carpet bag containing her few belongings, her journal, and the locket now hanging around her neck. Thomas stood beside her, straight back despite his 65 years, determined to show strength for her sake. "The college examiner will meet you," he reminded her. "Judge Parker's letter of recommendation is in your valise, and Michael's family will check on me, so don't worry." Nita smiled at his attempt to reassure her when she knew he was the one. Struggling with their first significant separation in 10 years, as the train whistle sounded, she embraced him tightly. "You saved me," she whispered. "Not just my life, but my spirit." Thomas shook his head, his voice rough with emotion. "No, Nita. We saved each other." The conductor called the final boarding, and Nita reluctantly stepped toward the train. At the steps, she turned back. "Father," she said, using the term she had carefully avoided for years, knowing what it would mean to him. "I will make you proud." Thomas's eyes glistened. "You already have, daughter. Every single day." As the train pulled away, Nita watched Thomas's figure grow smaller, standing tall on the platform, his hand raised in farewell. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling the weight of both her past and her future within its silver casing. She thought of the frightened child she had been, the woman she had become, and the journey still ahead. There would be obstacles. Prejudice did not disappear overnight, and the path she had chosen would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But she carried with her the strength of 2 cultures, the love of 2 families, and the unwavering belief that Thomas had instilled in her, that bridges could be built across the deepest divides, that family was defined by love rather than blood, and that even the most unlikely connections could become the most profound. As the train rounded a bend and the station disappeared from view, Nita opened her journal and began to write. Not about the past this time, but about the future she intended to create. A future where children like her would not be called savage, would not be sold as commodities, would not have to choose between their heritage and their dreams. It was a future that had seemed impossible 10 years ago, when a grieving widower had looked into the eyes of a traumatized Apache girl and recognized a kindred spirit. Together they had transformed impossible into inevitable, one day at a time. And as the New Mexico landscape rolled past her window, Nita Wilson, daughter of the Apache, daughter of Thomas, student, craftswoman, future teacher, smiled at the boundless possibility of what lay ahead.